Hey friends! If you enjoy powerful revenge stories, please subscribe. It only takes 1 second, but it helps this channel grow. Now let's begin. Arthur stood in the pouring rain, staring at the bright red eviction notice pinned to his front door. His bags were already piled on the wet pavement, his life's work packed into 3 cardboard boxes. Inside, the lights were on, and he could hear music playing. His landlord, Julian, opened the door, wearing Arthur's grandfather's vintage coat. Julian smiled, holding up a fraudulent ledger. He claimed Arthur owed 6 months of back rent, an absolute lie, and stated the £3,000 security deposit was being kept for property damages. Arthur had spent the last 5 years maintaining every inch of this building out of his own pocket. He had the receipts, but Julian had the local police chief on speed dial. As the rain soaked through his shirt, Arthur didn't yell or beg. He simply looked into Julian's greedy eyes. Julian laughed, slamming the heavy oak door shut and locking it from the inside. Arthur didn't walk toward a shelter. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in 10 years. It was time to unlock his family's trust. Arthur shifts from a state of helpless humiliation to cold, calculated determination as he realizes rules only apply to those who don't own the game. "Enjoy the warmth while it lasts, Julian," Arthur whispered into the dark, "because you just made your biggest tenant your future boss." The next morning, Arthur sat in a sleek boardroom across town, far away from the damp flat. His family's solicitor, Callum, pushed a thick leather binder across the mahogany table. For a decade, Arthur had lived humbly, hiding his immense wealth to prove he could survive on his own merits. Julian's cruelty had ended that experiment. Callum explained that the entire multi-story residential block was owned by a failing holding company desperate for cash. Julian was merely a low-level property manager holding a tiny minority stake. Arthur signed the papers, transferring £2 million in an instant. But he told Callum to keep his name completely off the public registry. He wanted a proxy corporation to handle the acquisition. Later that afternoon, Julian received an urgent email. A mysterious foreign conglomerate had just made an aggressive, unrefusable offer to buy the entire building. Julian, believing he was about to secure a massive payout for his small share, instantly ordered champagne. He had no idea who was holding the pen. Arthur feels a sharp sense of validation as he weaponizes his hidden resources against the man who tried to ruin him. Julian toasted his own reflection in the window, completely unaware that his new employer was currently watching him from a parked car across the street. Arthur didn't just want the building, he wanted to know how deep Julian's corruption went. He used his new administrative access to review the property's financial history. What he discovered went far beyond stolen security deposits. Julian had been systematically overcharging every single tenant in the building, mostly elderly residents and young students who didn't know their rights. He kept 2 sets of books. One ledger showed the true rent collected, while the official report claimed the building was operating at a massive loss. This allowed Julian to avoid taxes while pocketing thousands in cash every month. Arthur met with Fiona, an elderly neighbor from the 3rd floor who had lived there for 30 years. Tearfully, she explained that Julian was threatening to evict her too, claiming her deposit was invalid. Arthur comforted her, promising things would change soon, but he didn't reveal his new identity yet. He needed the paper trail to be absolute. Arthur's personal anger transforms into a profound sense of justice as he sees the systemic pain Julian has inflicted on vulnerable people. Fiona handed Arthur a crumpled envelope of cash receipts, unaware she had just delivered the final piece of financial dynamite. On Thursday, Julian received a formal notice from the new parent company. A mandatory, top-to-bottom structural inspection was scheduled for the following morning. The email explicitly stated that the new owner's executive representative would be personally supervising the audit. Julian panicked. He had neglected major repairs for years, spending the maintenance budget on luxury holidays and expensive cars. He spent the entire night trying to patch up cracked pipes and painting over dangerous black mold in the basement. He even hired cheap, unlicensed workers to cover up structural flaws in the main hallway. Julian called his contact at the council, hoping to bribe his way out of the inspection, but the official line was dead. The new conglomerate had already locked down the local council's oversight committee. Julian paced the lobby, sweating through his expensive suit, waiting for the corporate executioner to arrive. Arthur feels a grim satisfaction watching his tormentors scramble in panic to cover up years of laziness and greed. The glass front doors slid open precisely at 9, and the sound of heavy leather shoes echoed through the tense lobby. Julian rushed forward, his hand extended, putting on his best salesman smile. But his hand remained hanging in the air. Stepping out from behind the corporate solicitors was Arthur, dressed in a flawless, bespoke charcoal suit. Julian stumbled backward, his face turning pale. He laughed nervously, assuming Arthur was there to beg for his old flat back or threaten him over the deposit. Julian threatened to call security, mocking Arthur's appearance. Then, Callum stepped forward and handed Julian the official corporate restructuring documents. Arthur wasn't a trespasser. He was the primary shareholder of the purchasing entity. Julian's jaw dropped. The solicitors formally announced that Julian's management contract was under immediate review. However, instead of firing him on the spot, Arthur smiled calmly and told Julian he would be kept on for a transition period. Julian felt a sudden wave of relief. He assumed Arthur was weak and still needed him to run the daily operations. Arthur experiences a cold thrill as he lets his enemy believe, even for a moment, that he has survived the initial blow. "I look forward to seeing your detailed maintenance logs by tomorrow morning, Julian," Arthur said smoothly, tapping the ledger. Julian spent the afternoon celebrating his apparent survival. He believed Arthur was just a trust fund boy who didn't understand the realities of property management. Julian decided to use the transition period to drain the building's remaining reserve accounts. He initiated a wire transfer of £50,000 from the tenant maintenance fund to his personal offshore account, labeling it as a management severance fee. He planned to clear the cash and disappear before Arthur realized the accounts were empty. What Julian didn't know was that Arthur had already installed real-time digital monitoring on every single corporate account. The moment Julian clicked the authorization button, an automatic alert flashed on Arthur's laptop. Arthur didn't stop the transfer. He needed Julian to commit an undeniable, high-level financial crime on camera. Arthur watches the digital trap snapshot, feeling the heavy satisfaction of watching a thief seal his own doom. The progress bar on the illegal wire transfer hit 100%, triggering an automatic notification to a very specific email address. Instead of running, Julian grew arrogant. He cornered Arthur in the courtyard later that evening. Julian claimed he possessed old building records that proved the previous owners had used illegal materials, which would ruin the property's market value if exposed. He demanded a massive payout and a full release of liability, or he would leak the documents to the press and tank Arthur's new investment. Julian thought he had regained the upper hand. He stood tall, sneering at Arthur, waiting for the young man to break. Arthur simply listened, his face completely expressionless. He didn't argue, nor did he deny the allegations. He pulled a small digital recorder from his breast pocket, showed Julian that it had been active the entire time, and walked away without saying a single word. Arthur experiences absolute clarity, realizing his opponent's desperation is causing him to make fatal structural errors. Julian's smirk dissolved into a mask of pure terror as the realization of his recorded extortion echoed in his ears. Arthur called an emergency meeting in the main lobby, inviting every single tenant in the building. Fiona, the students, and the young families all gathered, whispering in confusion. Julian was forced to attend, standing at the back, still believing his offshore cash made him safe. Arthur took the podium. He didn't talk about architecture or corporate profits. He project-screened the hidden financial ledger directly onto the lobby wall. The spreadsheet clearly detailed every stolen security deposit, every illegal rent hike, and the exact names of every tenant Julian had cheated over the last 5 years. The room erupted into furious murmurs. Julian tried to push through the crowd to shut off the projector, but 2 large corporate security guards blocked his path. Arthur feels a powerful wave of communal vindication as the truth is finally dragged into the unforgiving light of day. "Look closely at line 42, Julian," Arthur announced over the microphone. "That's the exact date you stole Fiona's winter heating allowance." Julian yelled out that the documents were forged, claiming Arthur was using his wealth to fabricate a smear campaign. But Arthur wasn't done. He stepped aside as the side door opened, and a man in a dark suit walked in. It was Alastair, Julian's longtime accountant and the man who had helped him set up the fraudulent secondary books. Alastair carried a certified box of physical bank statements and signed tax declarations. Faced with massive federal prison time, Alastair had agreed to a full immunity deal with Arthur's legal team. He stepped to the microphone and confirmed every single detail of the fraud, admitting he had personally helped Julian hide the stolen tenant deposits for years. Arthur watches his enemy's support system completely collapse, leaving the villain entirely isolated. Alastair looked directly at his former partner and said, "It's over, Julian. I gave them the encryption keys to your offshore accounts." Julian reached for his phone, desperately trying to contact the local police chief he had bribed for years. But before he could dial, the main lobby doors opened again. Two investigators from the Serious Fraud Office stepped inside, accompanied by uniformed officers. The local chief had been suspended that morning following an anonymous tip containing copies of Julian's bribe payments. The investigators presented a freezing order, instantly locking every single one of Julian's personal and corporate bank accounts, including the offshore fund he had tried to drain yesterday. Julian was completely broke, stripped of his authority, and surrounded by the very people he had tormented. Arthur feels the cold weight of absolute authority as the system that once crushed him now turns its full power against his oppressor. The investigator stepped toward Julian, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. Julian backed away, his hands raised in panic. He looked at the angry faces of the tenants, then finally fell to his knees in front of Arthur. He begged for mercy, asking Arthur to drop the corporate charges in exchange for a full return of the building's shares and a written apology. He wept openly, complaining about his reputation and his family name. Arthur looked down at him, remembering the cold rain, the wet pavement, and the red notice pinned to his door just days ago. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt only a profound, detached pity for a man who defined his entire existence by what he could steal from others. Arthur experiences a profound shift from seeking personal vengeance to realizing he has already outgrown his enemy entirely. "You didn't care about my family name when you wore my grandfather's coat, Julian," Arthur said softly. The police officers moved in, pulling Julian to his feet and securing his wrists behind his back. The crowd of tenants watched in complete silence as the former landlord was led out of the building he had treated like his personal kingdom. His expensive shoes scuffed against the concrete lobby floor he had refused to clean. Outside, a small crowd of local journalists had gathered, tipped off by Callum's office. Flashbulbs illuminated Julian's tear-streaked face as he was pushed into the back of a police transport van. The illusion of his power was completely shattered within minutes. Arthur feels a deep sense of relief as the physical presence of malice is permanently removed from the community. The heavy metal doors of the police van slammed shut, cutting off Julian's final desperate shouts. 6 weeks later, the final judicial hearing took place in a crowded Crown Court. Julian sat in the dock, looking thin, gray, and completely defeated in a cheap, standard-issue suit. The prosecution presented the integrated ledger, Alastair's testimony, and the digital tracking of the offshore wire transfer. The judge didn't show an ounce of leniency. She noted that Julian's actions weren't just financial crimes, but systematic psychological abuse of vulnerable citizens. Julian was sentenced to 7 years in a maximum security facility, with an order for full financial restitution to every past and present tenant. Arthur experiences the finality of institutional justice, knowing the victory is recorded permanently in law. The judge's gavel struck the wooden block, sounding exactly like a door locking for the next 7 years. The following Saturday, Arthur held another meeting in the refurbished courtyard. The black mold was gone, the pipes were replaced, and the building was pristine. Arthur distributed certified bank drafts to every resident. Fiona received a check for £15,000, representing her stolen deposit and years of illegal overcharges. The young families and students received similar payouts, completely wiping away their financial stress. Arthur also announced that the building was being transitioned into a tenant-owned cooperative, meaning they would all share in the property's actual profits moving forward. Arthur feels a profound sense of warmth as his personal wealth is used to rebuild the lives of the people around him. Fiona hugged Arthur tightly, her tears of anxiety replaced by tears of pure, unadulterated relief. Arthur stood on the roof terrace of the building, looking out over the city skyline as the evening sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool and crisp, completely different from the suffocating dampness of the flat he had been forced out of weeks ago. He had taken his grandfather's vintage coat back from Julian's seized property, and it now rested comfortably on his shoulders. He was no longer running from his past or hiding his true identity out of fear. He had used his power to protect his neighbors, fix a broken system, and reclaim his dignity. He took a deep breath, feeling completely light for the first time in his life. Arthur achieves absolute peace, realizing that true wealth isn't about owning the bricks and mortar, but the freedom to do what is right. Some people buy property to build a fortune, but I bought mine just to remind a thief that justice always collects its debt.